Hello, and welcome to Lesson 9 of World Religions, in which we are going to discuss Judaism. Now, please excuse the raspiness of my voice. I am coming off a pretty severe cold as I am recording this lecture, but I've decided to power through it. So right in the beginning, Houston Smith kind of talks about Judaism's impact on the West. And he goes through Michelangelo's David and the Sistine Chapel to famous works of art and poetry like Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. But what Houston Smith kind of segues into is this kind of humbleness that goes along with the Hebrews. He talks about them being latecomers to the stage of history, that by 3000 BCE, Egypt already had, her pyramids, and Sumer and Akkad were world empires. But even down to their choice of where they were going to reside, their land, Canaan, was a postage stamp of a country. They were a small group in number, and because of this, they kind of suffered the small group exploits that usually happen in history. They're pushed around a lot. But what lifted the Jews from obscurity to permanent religious greatness was their passion for meaning. And for us in particular, we're going to focus on how their search for meaning and what they defined within their meanings. How did that become part of their identity? How did that help with the struggles they endured? But for Houston Smith, the bulk of this chapter focuses on meaning, how the Jews were able to discover meaning and how that meaning molded their identity. And what Houston Smith starts off with, and possibly the most logical thing to start off with, is the Jewish meaning in God. In the beginning, God. So from the beginning to the end, the Jewish quest for meaning was rooted in their understanding of God. Now, Houston Smith goes on to say that no matter a people's philosophy, they always have to account for the other, this God figure. And there are two reasons why. One, no one seriously claims to be self-created, created by other humans. Thus, mankind has issued from something other than itself. What they mean here is we did not create ourselves. We are limited in that ability to create ourselves. In fact, that first creator. So since there's no way we created ourselves, something else must have created us. And the second reason is everyone at some point finds his or her own power limited. So then they create the other to kind of underscore one's limitations. We understand our limitations. We understand our finite beings. So we create this infinite being in order to kind of atone for our limitations. But where the triumph of the Jewish thought prevails lies in their refusal to surrender the meaning of the other to the alternatives being the prosaic, the chaotic, the amoral, the hostile. They refuse to see their creator, the other, as these things. And Houston Smith kind of breaks it down one by one, why the resistance. So the first one is they resisted the prosaic. Now, when you hear prosaic, you can think of ordinary, underwhelming, kind of the anti-poetic. And they resisted the prosaic by characterizing or personifying the other in a specific way. This concept of brute matter or brute dead matter governed by blind impersonal laws is kind of late to the field of understanding. For early peoples, the sun could bless or scorch. the earth. It gave it fertility, the gentle rains and terrible storms, the mystery of birth and the reality of death were not to be explained by clots of matter regulated by mechanical laws. They were parts of the world that were pervaded by feeling and purpose throughout. That is why Houston Smith goes on to talk about the anthropomorphism in early Hebrews that could imagine ultimate reality as a person walking through a Garden of Eden in a cool morning. Now think about that. Ultimate reality as an individual walking through a Garden of Eden. So it's almost as if Jews found greater depth in people than any other wonders at hand. People weren't ordinary. People weren't uninspired. People were beautiful, full of depth, full of wonder. And it's this kind of personification that leads this resistance to the prosaic. From there, we move on to the Jewish resistance of the chaotic. Now, for the Jews, and the way they differed from their neighbors is that they focused the other is as a single, supreme, nature-transcending will. For in the Hebrew Bible, nature is an expression of a single Lord of all being. The Hebrew Bible does contain references to gods other than Yahweh, but the gods are different in two respects. They owe their origin to Yahweh. So you are God's children of the Most High, all of you. And that is Psalm 82:6. And second, unlike Yahweh, they were mortal. You shall die like mortals and fall like any other prince. And that is Psalm 82:7. So you can think of these other gods as God's subordinates. There is only one true God. Now, what this does, this is why they resisted the chaotic, it introduces focus to the religious life. To have more than one God is to divide loyalties, darting from, as Houston Smith states, one cosmic bureaucrat to another. So for the Jews, there must be a singleness to the other that supports the way. There has been the foundation of Jewish belief. Hear, O Israel, the Lord of gods, the Lord is one. And that's Deuteronomy 6.4. So in particular, this is how they resisted the chaotic, by focusing on one single other. Now, the Jews also resisted an amoral or hostile other or amoral God. We as human beings understand the ideology that interpersonal life flows more smoothly when people behave morally. I mean, we can even see this in traffic when we see somebody pull all the way to the front and cut everybody else off. You know, things jam up. Life doesn't flow as easy. We get angry because we see this as somebody behaving amorally. A really interesting point that Houston Smith brings up is this example through Lucretius. And what he states is that Lucretius preached atheism on the grounds that were actually religious, because the gods of that time, the Roman gods, were immoral, vindictive, and capricious. So a meaningful existence would require that they oppose or reject these gods. So morality kind of takes a step ahead of gods. That morality is more important than the gods themselves. And one could actually argue that if the gods were amoral, then the right thing to do would be to oppose them. That's why Houston Smith brings up this example right here. And also to kind of contrast the fact that the gods for the Jews possess none of these traits. Supreme achievement in Jewish thought was not in monotheism, was not in a singular concept of the God, but the character that the Jews ascribed to that God, to that one. As opposed to the Greeks and Romans and the Syrians, the Jews did not want an amoral nor indifferent God, one who was indifferent towards humankind. They did not want that. The Jewish one watched over the widows, cared for the orphans, wasn't aloof. Yahweh would speak the name of Abraham, lifting his people out of slavery, and seek out the lonely, the heartsick, the exiles in Babylon. The God for the Jews was a God of righteousness, love everlasting, and whose tender mercies are in all of his work. So to kind of wrap up, it was not prosaic, because at its center sits enthroned a being of awesome majesty. It was not chaotic, for it coheres to a divine unity. There's not separate gods. There is a singular one. And the reverence of an amoral or indifferent God was not like the Jewish God. The Jewish God is one of righteousness and love. So we can kind of see how this concept and meaning in God molded the behavior of the Jews as opposed to their neighbors. Having something to look up to, full of righteousness, full of love, who cares about you, denotes a different personality and a different identity than worshiping a God who is amoral and indifferent towards humanity, does not care, is non-poetic, and wholly chaotic. So now with this understanding of a righteous God in Yahweh, we're going to move towards the Jewish meaning in creation. This chapter in Houston Smith always gets me for its power, because you want to talk about what can motivate a people. This understanding of creation, this meaning in creation that the Jewish people adhered to, is inspiring. Now, people other than the Jews of the time saw that, the God can be good, but the world is not. This is kind of the cynicism in Greece and Jainism of India. But for Judaism, they affirm the world's goodness, arriving at that conclusion through the assumption that God created it. God created the heavens and the earth and pronounced it to be good. This comes from Genesis 1.1. Now, this first part of this affirmation, God created, what does it mean that the universe is God created? Well, for Houston Smith, it means that life is worthwhile. When it gets rough, it makes sense to continue to live. So God is a being in whom power and value converge, whose will cannot be thwarted, and whose will is good. Denoting these two understandings, you can see that existence, therefore, must have unimpeachable worth, because it's created by somebody good who cares about you and makes sure to ascribe value to all that he does. What is the alternative? Taking the T.S. Eliot small short story from The Cocktail Party, it states, Cecilia, who has been not just disappointed but disillusioned in love, goes to a psychiatrist for help and begins her first session with this surprising statement. I must tell you that I should really like to think there's something wrong with me. Because if there isn't, then there's something wrong with the world itself. And that's much more frightening. That would be terrible. So I'd rather believe there's something wrong with me that I could be put right. Now, this kind of understanding takes a different approach to when things go wrong. Because when things go wrong, you have two options. You can blame the stars and say that the fault lies in the heavens. Human beings are helpless. Trouble stems from botched characters of existence itself, which is beyond their power to remedy. It is outside my control, and there's no use in trying because it lies outside my will or my free will. And then there's the second part. The fault lies not in the stars, but ourselves. It challenges the people to look closer to home, search for the problem in places where they can affect change. The Jewish people affirmed that the world is God created and God has equipped them with the constructive premise to do something. Meaning was always waiting to be won. The opportunity to respond creatively was never absent. So basically, your problem is not the problem. Your response is the problem. If you look deep enough, there always will reside meaning. There always will reside a creative way to respond to this thing. You have free will. You have the ability to mold and change your future. In fact, the Jews go even further to say it's your responsibility to do so, but we'll get to that later on. But you can see how this understanding of creation, or the meaning in creation, can really light a fire of passion within the Jewish people. Now, this understanding of creation goes even farther to start including nature and the physical, this material component of creation. Now, if you think about what we've gone through so far, especially in Hinduism, the finite or the material actually holds people back. The Greek view is much more dim, as matter is like barbarian almost, spoiling everything it touches. And this was not the same, but kind of a similar ideology that the Indian philosophy was going after. You know, the destroyer of Shiva, she was a god because of her ability to destroy the finite, leaving the finite for the immaterial, for the infinite. So salvation in particular involved freeing the soul from its material container. That's kind of where we've gone so far. Plato also emphasizes this in the Republic when he talks about the divided line in the realm of the forms. If you are in the realm of the material, your knowledge cannot get past mere opinion. That's how powerful the material world's sway is upon your knowledge. You have to go beyond the material world and see that for what it is. TSD, what is it? This essential nature. You need to get to this realm of the forms in order to obtain knowledge itself. If you are stuck in the material world, the highest form of understanding you can achieve is mere opinion, because you exist in a world of constant change, constant flux, and knowledge cannot be fluctuating. Knowledge has to persist. Anyway, try not to get too far off topic here. You can kind of understand how so far the material world has been seen as limiting. You cannot find salvation in the material world. But for the Jewish people, in the first chapters of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Pressing for meaning in every direction, the Jews refused to abandon the physical aspect of existence as illusory, as defective or unimportant. Nature was to be relished. In the promised land, the abundance of food made it the promised land. It was a good land, a land with flowering streams, with springs and underground waters welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees, of pomegranates, of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity. And this is Deuteronomy 8.7 to 8.8. Sex was good. Marriage was held in high regard. Prophets' denunciation of inequalities of wealth was reverse of the opinion that possessions were bad. They are so good that more people should have them. This is an incredible twist on religious ideology. The fact that the material world and possessions were so good, everybody should have them. And as far as nature goes, it takes a much different turn than Taoism. For the Jewish people, God says, let them have dominion over all the earth. For this, as Houston Smith states, we find an appreciation of nature that's blended with the confidence in that human power has the ability to work with it for good. So, to wrap it up, material aspects of life are important. Hence the strong emphasis in the West on humanitarianism and social services. Matter can participate in the condition of salvation itself as well, as affirmed by the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. Nature can also host the divine, as the kingdom of God can come to earth. So this is a much different understanding of creation, not only in the material world, but the understanding of when things go wrong, where does the fault lie? That if meaning exists in existence, if there is meaning in existence that's waiting to be found, the opportunities are only as strong as your ability to respond creatively to them. Meaning in human existence. For Houston Smith, the most crucial element in human thinking is self-directed. Basically, what does it mean to be a human self, to live a human life? And here too, the Jews looked for meaning. But they're intensely interested in human nature. But not for the brute facts of human nature, but truth for life. From here, Houston Smith talks about human limitations. Basically, that the Jews were very aware of human limitations compared with the majesty of the heavens. And compared with the majesty of heavens, people are dust. This comes from Psalms 103-14. Even compared to the vastness and power of nature itself, we can be crushed like a moth. Job 4:19. Even this brief span of existence is laced with pain that causes our years to end as a sigh. Psalm 90.9. So what are human beings that God should give them a second thought? Psalm 8.4. Now, if you remember the prevailing chapters, you'll know that for the Jews, they did not want to give up the amoral God or the indifferent God towards human beings. They believed in a God who was very much interested in human beings and human nature. So what did the Jewish people focus on when it came to human nature? Well, it's that without blinking, it's its frailty. It went on to affirm its unspeakable grandeur. We are a blend of dust and divinity. So there's a couple things to unravel there. First, it's because we are doomed, basically. It's because we are frail that we see things as magnificent. It's because we're doomed that moments are special. And when it comes to dust and divinity, Houston Smith wants to make sure he's not talking about hyperbole here. In the King James Version, it translates a sensual Jewish claim concerning the human station that thou hast made him a little lower than angels, which is Psalm 8.5. But this last word, according to Houston Smith, is a straight mistranslation. For the original Hebrew plainly reads that we are a little lower than the God. So why the first translation? Well, according to Houston Smith, it's because they lacked the boldness that the Hebrews had. The Hebrews unabashedly said, or put us on a pedestal right below God. But this speaks to this Jewish meaning in human existence, or the meaning that they saw in human existence. For even the Jewish warriors were seen with incredible realism. Stated from Houston Smith, warts and all, as David is presented so unvarnished. So much so that the book of Samuel has been called the most honest historic writing of the ancient world. So the Jewish people see this realism in their heroes, not as a crutch, but as things that should be celebrated. So much so that there's a rabbinic saying that when a man or woman walks down the street, he or she is preceded by an invisible choir of angels crying, "Make way, make way, make way for the image of God." So in comes limitations. For we often don't feel like these second to God type of deities. So where are these limitations? Well, for the Jews, the limitations weren't so much physical as they were moral. We are frail, but more than that, we're sinners. We are born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. Psalm 51:5. But this is not to be misconstrued as total human depravity or that sex is evil, because Judaism wants nothing to do with this. So don't read this as because we're born guilty that humans are depraved individuals and there's no aspect of redeeming, or even so that sex is evil. Again, that has nothing to do with Judaism. And in here, we get into this notion of sin. Now, sin comes from the root word to miss the mark, something people continue to do. We are meant to be noble, but we usually amount to something less. We're meant to be generous, but we often withhold from others. We're created as more than animals, but we often sink to being nothing more. We often miss the mark on human potential. That potential of that divinity is there. There is that optimism that we can reach such echelons. It's just, that's where sin comes in, is the fact that we miss the mark. And how do we miss this mark? Through free will. The first human act involved free choice. Adam and Eve were seduced by the snake, but it was them who chose to eat the forbidden fruit. So once created, human beings basically make or break themselves. So for the Jews, it's cease to do evil, learn to do good. Isaiah 116-17. You have a choice. I have set before you life and death, therefore choose life. Deuteronomy 30-19. So we can reach this potential. We can reach this understanding because in human nature and in human existence, God loves people. People are God's beloved children. And we can walk with this confidence as we traverse our human lives, as we experience our human existence. We can walk with this confidence of children in a home in which we are fully accepted. So to basically wrap this up, if you were to remove human frailty as grass, as a sigh, as dust, as a moth crushed, the estimate becomes romantic. But I read this more as life becomes uninteresting. Without this frailty, things aren't seen with as much grandeur. Hence, moving on to the next one, if you remove grandeur, us being a little lower than gods, aspiration recedes. This world doesn't become as welcoming. It's not made with us in mind. And if you remove sin, this tendency to miss the mark, sentimentality starts to threaten, according to Houston Smith. There's nothing to shoot for anymore. And if you remove freedom, choose ye this day, responsibility goes by the wayside. We see this, especially with victimhood mentality, that if you blame some other primordial force, you take yourself out of the equation. You take your ability to change things out of the equation, and you put it into somebody else's hands. And finally, if you remove divine parentage, life becomes estranged. We're almost like cut loose and adrift in the cold, indifferent seas that we are created. So these are things that the Jews refuse to remove. and even more so, choose to celebrate within the scope of human existence. And now finally we get to what is probably the most important meaning in this section of Judaism. And that is the search for meaning in history. But before Houston Smith gets into the Jewish understanding of meaning in history, he starts with a contrast, pretty much things we have talked about thus far in world religions as far as it pertains to history. And to outline this contrast, there's a quote here. A historian writes, "Ultimate reality is disclosed when man, either by rational contemplation or mystic assent, goes beyond the flow of events, which we call history." I mean, that was the goal in Hinduism, in order to kind of snap the circle of endless creation, rebirth, and death. Even so much so that the world of experience was considered an illusion or Maya. Even in Greek philosophy, there's this idea that you could soar above the reoccurring cycles of history by fixing one's mind upon the unchanging absolute, which belongs to the eternal order. This is this idea in Plato especially, this realm of the forms, this unchanging scope that lies beyond the experiential world, that must be attained if you are going to obtain truth. But this is much different than the biblical claim that God is found within the limitations of the world, of change and struggle, and especially that he reveals himself in the events which are unique, particular, and unrepeatable. And I want you guys to try to understand what kind of mentality this would press upon an individual who takes these meanings as the truth. For the Bible, in the Bible, history is neither Maya nor a circular process of nature. It is the arena of God's purposive activity. So why the adherence to this kind of understanding of history? Why is this view so unrelenting? Well, according to Houston Smith, there's something really particular that's at stake here when we ask if there is meaning in history. If there is no meaning in history and history was meaningless, it would follow that social, political, and cultural context of life also don't warrant active concern. We shouldn't care about these things, basically. So if history is meaningless, social history is meaningless. Our social lives are meaningless. Our cultural lives are meaningless. Thus, the Hebrew estimate of history was the exact opposite of this attitude of indifference. To the Jews, history was of towering significance. It was important, first, because they were convinced that the context in which life is lived affects that life in every way, setting up its problems, delineating its opportunities, and conditioning its outcomes. History gives purpose. Social interactions give purpose. That's what Houston Smith means when he talks about it's impossible to separate Adam and Noah from Eden and the flood. You cannot talk about Adam without talking about Eden. You can't talk about Noah and his accomplishments and what he meant without the flood. It is the history and the context of which we live that gives meaning. Without this kind of context, there is no meaning. So the events the Hebrew Bible relates are profoundly contextual. And secondly, another reason why history was of towering significance is because if contexts are crucial for life, so is the collective action or social action. And this is a focus on this social aspect, because sometimes we can only get things done or things changed by working together, planning, organizing, then acting in concert. Think about the slaves of Egypt. They didn't rise individually by cultivating liberty of spirit so they could tolerate the physical chains. They didn't change their attitude and become enlightened to accept their chains and bondages. They needed to stand up collectively and break for the desert. So it is the context that surrounded them that gave them meaning. It wasn't this enlightenment on the other side of the bridge that they sought out in order to accept their chains. That's really what Houston Smith is trying to focus on right here. It's the fact that context is important, that social and collective actions become important, and thus there are times where we need to work together to incorporate change. And that's another way history is so significant. So this leads to the third aspect of how history is such a towering significance. It's that history was important for the Jews because they saw it as a field of opportunity, a theater of God's glory, if you may. It is through this understanding of nothing happens by accident. Yahweh's hand is at every work and every event. With Eden, the flood, Exodus, the Babylonian exile, shaping each sequence into a teaching experience for his people. And this is obviously controversial because you can ask yourself, what about these earthquakes in Haiti that take out innocent children? How could there be purpose there? There may not be. There may not be somebody to blame. But if we were to change our attitude and say, is there something we can learn from this devastation? You see how that kind of flips philosophically our frame of mind? That's the point here. This leads to the fourth and final aspect of history's towering significance. It's that life's opportunities are not monotonously alike. Events are important, but not equally important. Each opportunity is unique, but some are more decisive than others. And when an opportunity passes, they're gone forever. So you need to take the opportunities that are presented to you. Some may not be as decisive as others, but still, these opportunities are not going to come around again. They are rare events. From here, Houston Smith really goes into the uniqueness of this kind of point of view. And it's unique because the way they saw God is that God directly intervenes in history at certain points. Considering his chosen people, it was God, that God wasn't inactive. He called on Abraham to go forth into the new land and establish a new people and become the first Hebrews, the first chosen ones. So thus far, we have noted, the kind of meaning they found in history. But we must ask, what enabled them to see history as embodying this meaning? And what basically enabled them to see history like this is because they had this different idea of God. For them, God would not have created people as material beings if matter were adventitious to their destiny. Nature and matter are created by design, not by chance. They are important to human beings. And this is because nature was created by God. God cannot be assimilated to it. So Jews would have argued that nature is not self-sufficient. For Houston Smith, the consequence of keeping God and nature distinct is momentous because it means that the ought cannot be assimilated to the is. God's will transcends and can differ from imminent actuality. Now, for philosophy, it's important to understand this ought from is correlation. Just because nature is a certain way and was created a certain way doesn't mean that we ought to abide and follow it to the T. That's where this ought from is comes from. Nature is subject to critique. We can improve it. Just because it is a certain way doesn't mean we ought to act in a certain way. Just because a particular flower is red doesn't mean that all flowers ought to be red. Just because the rivers flow in a specific direction doesn't mean it ought to from here on in. This subject of critique is very important because those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. History is a tension between its divine possibilities and its manifest frustration. A sharp tension exists between the ought and the is. Just because something is made a certain way doesn't mean it ought to be that way from here on in. Things are subject to change. Things can bend to our will. This is what Houston Smith means when he said, when things are not as they should be, change in some form or another is in order. We cannot just take that as, it is what it is. There's nothing we can do about it because it ought to be that way because it's created in that certain way. No. If things aren't the way they should be, they ought to be changed. We should change them. And this is how Houston Smith kind of concludes this section. On fire with the conviction that things were not as they should be, they created in the name of God, for whom they spoke, an atmosphere reform that put Hyde Park in the best days of muckraking newspapers to shame. They stood for change. They stood for reform. And all of this comes from the simple idea or meaning within history and the importance of the material world that we exist in right now. Just because things are made a certain way doesn't mean they ought to be that way from here on in. And with that, we'll move on to the meaning in morality. So this section starts out with Houston Smith reiterating that human beings are social creatures. If we're separated from birth from other humans, we never become fully human. Yet, living with others, we often become barbaric. So the Jews took it upon themselves to formulate those wise restraints that make men free, which is contained in the Jewish law. Now, the Hebrew Bible contains no less than 613 commandments that regulate behavior. But for our purposes, and luckily for Houston Smith, he breaks it down, he believes 4 will suffice. For it is through these that the Hebrew morality has had its greatest impact. Then he goes over kind of like how jealousy, hatred, and revenge can lead to violence that, unless checked, can rip communities apart. And how murder can incite such a blood feud that can drag on indefinitely. And sex can rouse passion so intense that it destroys entire communities. So we must contain our appetites if history is to continue. And that's where this morality comes from. Houston Smith focuses on 4 ethical precepts to the 10 Commandments. And the reason there's precepts here is because these are the 4 commandments that need to be understood for any of the other commandments to make sense whatsoever. It's kind of like the first laws that need to be in place in order for law to exist at all. An example of this would be something like, you don't want to lie all the time or else communication is just going to crumble. For us to have a conversation, there needs to be an undertone or a supposed truth telling to the conversation, or we're not going to communicate at all. So it's kind of like a meta understanding that we need to agree upon in order for communication to be available. So that's what the precepts kind of mean here. So the first ethical precept focuses on force. And what Houston Smith states here is that you can bicker and fight, but killing within the in-group will not be permitted, for it instigates those blood feuds that shreds community. Therefore, thou shalt not murder. The next one focuses on sex. You can be a rounder, you can be flirtatious, even promiscuous. And though such behavior isn't really commendable, the law won't be after you. But sexual indulgence of married persons outside the nuptial bond will not be allowed. Therefore, thou shalt not commit adultery. You're kind of seeing a pattern here. These precepts that must be in place for a community to exist at all. And then they move on to possessions. You may make your pile as large as you please, and be shrewd and cunning in the enterprise, but you cannot pilfer directly from someone else's pile. Thou shalt not steal. For this outrages the sense of fair play and builds animosities that become ungovernable. And then finally, they move on to the spoken word. You may dissemble and equivocate, but there is one time where you are required to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that is when you are brought before a tribunal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. And it is after this final commandment that Houston Smith really highlights the fact that these commandments are universal, not in their finality, not in that this is it and the final word, but in their foundational property. This is what I alluded to earlier. They do not speak the final word on the topics they touch. They speak the words that must be spoken if other words are to follow. This is what is meant by meta-truths or meta-laws, these things that must be agreed upon in order for agreements to be possible at all. And this is also why, over 3,000 years after Mount Sinai, they continue to be the moral exemplars of the world, or as Houston Smith calls them, the moral Esperanto of the world. And now we come to meaning injustice. And right from the start, Houston Smith states, it is to a remarkable group of men, whom we call the prophets more than any others, that Western civilization owes its conviction that 1, the future of any people depend in large part on the justice of its social order, and 2, that individuals are responsible for the social structures of their society, as well as for the direct personal dealings. Now, the word prophet comes from the Greek word prophetis, which means for, and the fetus, which means to speak. Thus, a prophet is someone who speaks for someone else. Now, this is faithful to the original Hebrew, for its generic meaning is one who speaks on the authority of another, or more specifically, one who speaks for God. There has even been occasions when the body of the prophet could become a conduit through which God addresses immediate historical conditions. Now, for our purposes, it's not very important to understand the 3 stages of the prophetic movement. The first stage being the guilds themselves, where the group phenomena is more important than the individual. And then it turns into much more of an ethics-centered type of stage, where they begin to launch individuals like rockets from bands that form their base, where the divine speak more clearly through them. And then finally, the great writing prophets, where it's good to understand the great writing prophets because the pre-writing prophets challenged individuals. The writing prophets challenged corruption in the social order and oppressive institutions, which at the time there were many. But really where our focus comes in is the power of the prophet in reference to justice itself. Think of the story of Naboth, who, because he refused to turn over his family vineyard to King Ahab, was framed on false charges of blasphemy and subversion and then stoned, as blasphemy was a capital crime. His property then reverted to the throne. So when the news of this tragedy reached Elijah, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Go down and meet Ahab, king of Israel. Say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, you have killed and taken possession. In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will also lick up your blood.'" This is Kings 21:18-19. In reference to justice, you can see how this story carries revolutionary significance for human history. For this is a story of how someone without any official position took the side of a wronged man and denounced a king to his face on the grounds of injustice, speaking for an authority that is not his own. It is revolutionary in the fact that now kings, who were able to exercise their power and thought nothing of it because they were given this power mostly through divinity as they saw it. But it's how the prophets challenged this action that this revolutionary action really gets its meat. It was because Elijah was speaking for an ultimate authority that the king accepted his pronouncement as just. Houston Smith shares another story, one that I won't get into. But again, the power here is how the prophets challenged the action of those who were in charge. This is where the writing prophets come in because as I said before, whereas the pre-writing prophets challenged individuals, the writing prophets challenged corruption in the social order and oppressive institutions. So this is important because at this time, there was danger from all sides. The Jewish people were sandwiched between colossal empires of Assyria and Babylonia to the east, Egypt to the south, and Phoenicia and Syria to the north. So Israel and Judah were in danger of being crushed. Now, normally you would think that in this kind of situation, the outcome rested on the simple calculus of strength of power. However, this drains opportunity and hence meaning from such situations, according to Houston Smith. Basically, if outcome was decided by power, then there's not much a small nation can do. But the Jews resisted this kind of reading. And out of that became their unquenchable passion for meaning, everything we've discussed so far. And that's where these writing prophets come in. Because the way the Jews saw it, this was God's warning to clean up their national life and establish justice throughout the land or be destroyed. So that's where these writing prophets' challenge comes from, in that they're not focusing on individuals anymore. They're focusing on attacking corruption on a social scale and oppressive institutions. They're going after the big institutions here because they saw it as a warning from God. You're either going to clean up and establish justice throughout the land, or you're going to be crushed. And there's a kind of optimism that comes from this idea that political stability is social justice, for it is in the nature of things that injustice will not endure. God has high standards. Divinity will not put up with exploitation, corruption, and mediocrity forever. Those on the side of justice are on the side of attrition. using the quote on 292, right in the middle, if I created the world on a basis of the attribute of mercy alone, the world's sins would greatly multiply. If I created it on the basis of the attribute of justice alone, how could the world endure? I will therefore create it with both the attributes of mercy and justice, and may it endure. After this, Houston Smith goes on to name a bunch of different prophets, but for our purposes, what is common to them all is a conviction that every human being, simply by virtue of his or her humanity, is a child of God, and therefore in possession of rights that even kings must respect. And I think this is a good place to start. I know the page number listed beyond this, but I would hate to go into the meaning in suffering, which is very crucial to this chapter. I would hate to go just a couple pages and then leave it for next time. So this is where we're going to stop. We will go over meaning in suffering in the next lesson. Have a great day.